Bismillahirrahmanirrahim, in the name of Allah, the gracious, the merciful. Assalamu alaikum, everyone. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you. Jazakallah, Sister Aisha, for that introduction. And welcome, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you all to this very special program brought to you by the Alliance for Absolute Justice Women. Again, my name is Mansoura Siraji, and I'm a member of the Alliance for Absolute Justice Women's Executive Committee. I am very excited to introduce and really hear and learn from our panelists today. But before I introduce our panelists, we'll start, as we always do in our community, with recitation of the Holy Quran. And it'll be followed by English translation. And so without further ado, I welcome Sister Shayla Ahmed, another member of the AAJ Executive Committee, to start us off with recitation.
Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. I will be reciting from chapter 5, verse 9. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين لله شهداء بالقسط ولا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا هو أقرب للتقوى واتقوا الله إن الله خبير بما تعملون. Translation: O ye who believe, be steadfast in the cause of Allah, bearing witness in equity, and let not a people's enmity incite you to act otherwise than with justice. Be always just, that is nearer to righteousness, and fear Allah. Surely Allah is aware of that what you do.
Jazakallah, thank you for that beautiful recitation, Sister Shayla. Again, I wanted to welcome our speakers and all of our attendees who have, taken time out of your very busy Sundays to join us on this very important topic. We are here talking about voter suppression. Voter suppression, which is Jim Crow and new clothes. We are here just weeks after the governor of Texas passed sweeping legislation that would make voting harder and creates restrictions and complications for voters, and has been rightfully called Jim Crow 2.0. We're also here just months. I mean, we had another event, I think it was in either March or April, that was just months after Georgia did the same thing. And in Texas and Georgia are just two of dozens of states that are seeking to suppress the vote. Now, while there are powerful voices out there seeking to suppress their vote, there are incredibly courageous women amongst us, including our wonderful guests who are working day and night to ensure that we live in a truly representative democracy and a society that truly embodies absolute justice. Now, before I introduce our panelists, I just wanted to very briefly provide an introduction on who we are. That is the Alliance for Absolute Justice Women. We are an advocacy organization led by Muslim women dedicated to dismantling systemic inequities within our society that adversely impact women and marginalized groups. We do not endorse any political party, but advocate for the rights of all citizens, including the right to have access to voting. While we are relatively new here in the United States, we draw our inspiration from the living teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Prophet of Islam, who was perpetually concerned about upholding the rights of the oppressed. Okay, with that, I am honored to introduce our speakers, our first two speakers, Jessica Jones Caparel and Tappan Vickery. I'll caveat my intros by stating that I'm just providing the tiniest of snapshots on Jessica's and Tappan's sort of enormous body of work, and that's true for Dr. Boodram as well. So Jessica is the Policy and Legislative Affairs Senior Manager at the League of Women Voters of the United States. In this position, Jessica works to deliver the League's message around federal advocacy priorities through lobbying and the development of advocacy strategies. Jessica manages the day-to-day operations of the League's Volunteer Lobby Corps, a group of League members from Maryland, Virginia, and the District of Columbia who work to deliver the League's message to Capitol Hill on behalf of state and local leagues across the country. She is an expert on League policy positions and works to implement grassroots strategies in coordination with League members and organizations and organizational partners, excuse me. Prior to joining the League, Jessica worked on political campaigns throughout the United States, focusing mostly on grassroots engagement, but also running statewide operations with communications field and online focus. Welcome, Jessica. We also have Tappan Vickery here with us. Tappan is the Director of Voter Engagement at HeadCount. She is a veteran organizer with 2 decades of nonprofit experience working in civic engagement, environment, and social justice. She also developed HeadCount's Field Organizer program to expand and increase HeadCount's impact in new and often underserved markets. Tappan develops and leads voter engagement campaigns, such as HeadCount's annual partnership with National Voter Registration Day, the March 24th, 2018 March for Our Lives, and subsequent Road to Change bus tour, and our 2020 Make Your Vote Count campaign. Welcome, Tappan. Welcome to you both, and I invite you to make your remarks.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I think Jessica's going to switch over. There we are. To our presentation. We actually worked on this together, which is unique for both of us, but we do very similar work. And I thought it made more sense, and Jessica agreed, and it was kind of fun to meet because we haven't worked together before in this way. Should we move forward, Jessica? You want to? So I just briefly want to introduce HeadCount, and then Jessica will have a chance to talk about the League. HeadCount is a nonpartisan voter registration organization and voter engagement organization, and we really look to find the intersections of culture and activism to empower people who are not otherwise talked to about the elections process. You know, a lot of people are kind of on campaign lists and they get a lot of calls and texts and mailers, but we really try to reach young and underserved voters who may not be the folks that are being touched by campaigns to empower them to engage in the process.
And greetings, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you this afternoon. The League of Women Voters is an organization founded after the 1920 adoption of the 19th Amendment, where women receive the right to vote. We believe in the power of women to create a more perfect democracy. That, of course, has been our vision since 1920 when we were founded. And for 100 years, we've been a nonpartisan, activist, grassroots organization that believes voters should play a critical role in our democracy, whether that's policy or the active voting and finding out what your candidates believe in. We, of course, do not endorse political candidates or political parties. So we are excited to be with you here today and excited to engage voters throughout the process.
Thank you. I'm glad you turned your camera on. I wasn't sure if we were supposed to or not. So now I feel better that you're on too, because I know I can't see all of you, but I like to think that you can put a face with the voice. So I just want to briefly talk about the journey of voting rights and why we are in the situation that we're in. This is a very long timeline, but it's really important that we start at the very beginning, which is in 1789, which is when we established the Constitution of the United States. And in that Constitution is something called the Elections Clause, which gives the states authority to set voting rights for federal elections to decide when, where, and how, and also for state elections. At the same time, the federal government is also given authority to alter or change elections that aren't meeting or protecting the citizens of this country. Over time, various different groups have received the right to vote. Jessica just gave us a great overview of 1920, which is, of course, when women got the right to vote. Previous to that, of course, we addressed slavery and developed the Jim Crow South, which is here on the top line. And I should mention that because we are talking about the new Jim Crow. This was systemic disenfranchisement of Black voters throughout the South. So following the Civil War, people were given the right to vote based regardless of their previous condition of servitude. And when we moved into the Jim Crow era, the states began to pass laws that made it specifically harder for some people to vote. It could be a poll tax or a literacy tax. And so those will be things that are very, make it more challenging. And it was absolutely based on your color or class. Over time, we have different ethnic groups who received the right to vote, including the Chinese immigrants, Native Americans, and others. In 1965, there was landmark legislation that protected the right to vote called the Voting Rights Act. And we've seen it consistently over the past, I think it's had been renewed 5 times since then, and expanded on the Voting Rights Act. 1971 is one of my favorites. That's when 18 to 21-year-olds received the right to vote, or 20-year-olds received the right to vote. This was because of the Vietnam era. People were being drafted before they could actually vote, which was considered unconstitutional. And I'm going to move all the way around to 2013, which is when the Supreme Court repealed a key element of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And that is, we'll talk more about. Jessica, you want to move us forward? So the Voting Rights Act of 1965, this basically is a 95 years in the making structure to enforce the 15th Amendment. And it provided nationwide protections for voting rights. It prevented state and local government from discriminatory voting laws. That includes any laws that, as I discussed earlier, that would impact you based on your race or class, really based on your race at that point. And also, it's important that that's when we started to see the federal government flex their right in the Elections Clause to make changes. 2 types of prohibited discrimination were both vote denial and vote dilution. We're not going to get into vote dilution too much today, but that's when the power of your vote is impacted by how districts are drawn. And then, of course, vote denial is being unable to vote, having barriers put up that make it nearly impossible for you to vote. Next slide, please. So 2013 was the Shelby County v. Holder decision from the Supreme Court that we referenced on the timeline. This basically changed the Voting Rights Act so that there was no longer something called the pre-clearance requirement. Previous to that, states, and really across the country, not just in the South by this point, had to submit changes to election law to the federal government to make sure that they were not being discriminatory. And because of the evolution of the Voting Rights Act, it was really cool because it was not only just if the law was meant to be discriminatory, but also if the law had the effect of being discriminatory. And it really provided teeth. It was an enforcement mechanism so that we could make sure that people were protected and their freedom to vote was protected. Next slide. The reasoning that Justice Roberts wrote for this is that our society had changed so much since 1965, when this law was initially passed, that we were no longer using the right judgments when we had preclearance, and that we needed to have something that was more current. These two very dramatic photos, I think, show how much our society has changed since 1965. And I apologize if they're triggers for anyone, but I do believe it's important for us to remember we have a lot of the same problems we have for a very long time. The result of this change was in 2018, and we'll talk more about even more of a result in the past year, over the past year. But in 2018, we could see the direct impact of this change. We had 23 states that enacted restrictive laws. Voter ID laws went crazy. I think like something like 7 states passed on the same night when these laws came down. Elimination of polling places in Black and Brown communities, and also states that were previously covered by preclearance had the highest rate of voter roll purges. And that's basically when states decide to take you off the voter rolls because of a subsequent case. They can pretty much do it any way they want. And there is no standard procedure or process. So you can show up to vote and not be able to.
Sorry. So there's a couple of solutions that Congress has put forward and that federal lawmakers have put forward to solve kind of the problems that the Shelby County case has brought upon us. So this year alone, and Tappan has talked a little bit about 2018, but in 2021, since the 2020 election, we saw over 400 pieces of legislation that were meant to remove the rights and opportunities for different communities to vote. So one of the pieces of legislation in Congress right now is the John R. Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And one of the photos that where Tappan did the side-by-side, you could see Congressman John Lewis on the left, who is being beaten by state troopers. And so this act is named in his honor. And the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act addresses directly the decisions in the Shelby County case, and it also directly responds to a case that was decided this year in Brnovich versus DNC. So overall, it'll create a new formula that brings states into what's called a pre-clearance or permission, giving them permission to enact these laws, and it uses different amount of previous problem legislation or discriminatory things that they have done in order to bring them into this process. So it creates this new review and approval criteria for this legislation, and hopefully will prevent some of these racially discriminatory pieces of legislation that we've seen introduced. It also redefines what a voting rights violation is. So it redefines, what pieces of legislation are considered within the formula. So that could be anything from a voter ID law, in the before poll taxes were discriminated against. It's like counting how many beans are in a jar. Luckily, we don't have that, but that's an example of a discriminatory law in the past. It also reestablishes federal review and approval, so reestablishing that pre-clearance process. Restores the ability to challenge discrimination in court. So the decision in the Brnovich case earlier this year said that individuals could not challenge discriminatory laws in court, but this legislation gives that right back to people and allows those laws to be challenged. And then, of course, it increases transparency. One thing we know is that when people are getting ready to vote, they need to know all of the information, whether that's information about candidates or information about how to vote. So it requires states to provide the information do like a national notification system. So if any laws change in a certain window between when people are supposed to vote or get ready to vote and then vote. They have to publicly notify voters of those changes so that people can be prepared if they need to bring a voter ID, if they need, if they need to bring someone with them to vote, if a bunch of different things. So anytime a law changes, you have to notify someone. Go on to the next slide. And the other thing about this piece of legislation is so we won't see the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. It won't reverse the state bills that have already been enacted, like those in Texas, like those in Georgia, but it will make sure that future legislation is addressed and give it an opportunity not to go into effect if it's found to be discriminatory. So by bringing states back under that pre-clearance process, it will protect and empower voters. And again, it does respond directly to those Supreme Court decisions. Another key piece of legislation that you probably heard a lot of people talk about for the past several years is the For the People Act. Now, the For the People Act sets national standards for voting across the country. And it does this by expanding voter access and participation. So making sure that things like automatic voter registration, where you're automatically registered to vote when you do any interaction with a government entity, making sure that people can register online, allowing people to show up on election day and register to vote and then cast a ballot. So that's called same-day registration. And as well as other things, those are some of the pieces the league focuses on, but it's expanding access and participation. It also has another section that would end the dominance of big money in politics. So things like establishing a small donor campaign finance system where you could give $20 to a local candidate or to a congressional candidate, and then you would receive, that candidate would receive a 6-to-1 match if they chose to participate in the system. It also does things like put the Disclose Act, which is a law that requires corporations, it requires super PACs, it requires candidates to disclose who their donors are above a certain level. That seems like very common sense, right? Because we want to know who's trying to influence our votes. So who pays for those Facebook ads? Who pays for those ads on television? It requires those big groups that we always see to disclose their individual donors. It also does redistricting reform, which is part of the dilution of the vote that Tappan mentioned. So it would put the drawing of the lines in the hands of the people and allowing independent redistricting commissions to draw the lines, and it sets certain criteria and ensures that there's transparency and that people can participate in the process. For so many times in redistricting, we just see politicians introducing maps and then passing them right away. But this would make sure that there is plenty of public participation in the process. And then it also has some ethics and accountability things and make sure that, the checks and balances between the three different heads of three different parts of the government, the executive, judicial, and legislative branch are restored. Requires things like making sure that presidents have to disclose their tax returns. It puts an ethics system in place for the Supreme Court, which is surprisingly not something that we already have. So this bill has passed the House. Actually, this bill and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, they both passed the House. The problem, of course, is in the Senate. And the Senate has tried to pass this bill a few times, but they've been unsuccessful. But this last week, they actually introduced a new piece of legislation where they have been able to come to agreement with all 50 Democrats in the Senate, and Senator Manchin is working to bring on some of his Republican friends onto this bill, and this bill is called the Freedom to Vote Act. It includes a lot of different provisions like the For the People Act. So those online, that automatic, that same day registration. It also addresses voter purges. So making sure that you're not purged from the rolls just because you didn't vote, but making sure that you're purged from purged or removed. Purge is a kind of a negative word, but removed from the rolls because you don't live somewhere, or that they're making sure that they're keeping those voter rolls clean in a safe and responsible way. So it has 3 different buckets. So that's the expanding the right to vote bucket. And then it also decreases, of course, the influence of money in politics. So those same provisions I talked about, the small donor, the Disclose Act, and some pieces on making sure that super PACs can't openly coordinate with candidate campaigns, and a couple of other things. And then the other thing is that includes the gerrymandering provisions. It doesn't include the pieces on independent redistricting commissions, so it doesn't take the power out of the hands of the legislatures. But it does put in better criteria, so criteria that they have to follow for drawing maps. It does do a lot of transparency, ensuring that there's public participation in the process, which is incredibly important. And they're really great provisions. It doesn't include those ethics pieces, but we do think that this bill, the Freedom to Vote Act, will come up for its first vote in the Senate, potentially this week, as early as this week. So we hope that you'll be watching out for that. And there'll be some action alerts, I'm sure, on that legislation. And then finally, I just wanted to address how I talked about how the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act addressed current legislation, and of course it doesn't. But the For the People Act and the Freedom to Vote Act does address some of these bills that have already gone into effect. So it does that by creating national standards for federal elections, which would thwart virtually every state level anti-voter bill that has been introduced, and force these states to overturn some of the discriminatory and, just downright mean kind of provisions and legislations that prevent people from participating in the process. So we've got the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which is separate from the For the People Act and the Freedom to Vote Act. And we're going to be working to get the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act and now the Freedom to Vote Act passed in the Senate in the coming weeks and months. And I will pass it back over to Tab.
So thank you, Jessica. It gives me so much hope when I think about all of those provisions and how much change they could really bring. So I spoke briefly about up through 2018 in my little flashback before, but I want to talk a little bit about 2020. Despite the fact that we had a pandemic and the vast majority of states changed their election laws at least once during the cycle, if not more than once, about how you could vote or where you could vote, we had record turnout. 66.8% of all eligible Americans participated. It's phenomenal. Now we'll talk about, I'm not going to talk about the 43% that didn't show up because that's a whole nother conversation. We have a slide about that later. But it was phenomenal. And within that, it was the most secure election in American history. It has been proven through multiple investigations. It's great news. We knew going into 2020 that certain things were going to change afterwards, and we were hoping they were mostly going to change for the better. There have been bipartisan election reform committees and reviews for many years, and a lot of the changes that they were recommending were universal vote by mail, or to phase in vote by mail that doesn't require an excuse. Automatic voter registration, same-day registration, so that if you are purged from the rolls and you show up with a valid ID and can prove your identity and your residency, you can register to vote right there. So those things were already in the works and had true bipartisan support. And so when we move over to 2021, we have lived through what I'm comfortable saying, even on my nonpartisan stance, the big lie. We've lived through the media and the change in our society where people have really decided that they don't trust these things that were tried and true and established mechanisms that we were phasing in across the country. So the big shocking number that we heard earlier today as well is that over 400 restrictive laws have been introduced in 49 states. and 18 of those states have enacted 30. Now, I want to stop for a second and say that there were 900 laws that actually expanded the right to vote introduced at the state level, and that they have been passed at an astronomical rate. One of the most successful things that we've seen happen since I have been involved in this work is the reenfranchisement of people who were formerly convicted as felons. And right now there is a path towards reenfranchisement in every state, which is only about a year old and is really awesome. Some of the states make it really hard, but there are ways. So, you know, there's a lot of great change that has happened. So I don't want to be all negative, because I want you to know that that change, along with many of these others, came from citizen power and came from communities standing up for each other and using their power to reach out to elected officials and advocate for change at a grassroots and state-based level. Next slide, please. So here we are, 2021. We have all of the orange states here have made it harder for you to vote. The green states have made it easier, and the gray don't have major changes yet, but they have almost all introduced something where we may see changes. And, you know, it's impossible to not see that the trends in these states are often based on this narrative that there is fraud. Then we know that that narrative is false. Next slide.
Can I actually just stop for a second at that slide?
Yep.
The one of those days. I just wanted to here stop and very quickly give a very rough breakdown of where our participants are from. You know, you can kind of take a look at where you are on the map, because, you know, as you know, we'll discuss later, I think there's a lot you can do locally, but we have 10 from New York, 30 from Virginia, 29 from Maryland, 11 from Florida, 5 from Ohio, 2 from California, 2 from Georgia, 6 from Washington, 2 from Arizona, and 10 from Texas. It's just a very rough breakdown, but you know, we have participants from all over the country, and in different states are doing different things. So
if you're, and I will say Ohio, because you shouted it out, is a gray state. If you're in Ohio, I hope that you will reach out with whatever your thoughts are after this, because we do anticipate there to be additional changes in Ohio in the near future, which would probably make it orange. Next slide, please. So just to talk about Georgia, Georgia was in the news. They were the first ones to knock out these big changes. You know, I'm sure you've heard about not being able to have water passed out in the lines for people waiting while people are waiting. Georgia is actually famous for its lines. Sometimes you see people like 3 and 4 hours, and those lines are not in suburban white neighborhoods. Those lines are in inner city, traditionally Black communities. And there are some really, really amazing grassroots organizations that are local to the state of Georgia that have done phenomenal work to educate and empower their voters to overcome these lines. And that includes sometimes having food and water. It includes busing people to the polls. It includes creating a culture where people know where their drop boxes are and having more drop boxes that are local to them. And the laws this year really strip away all of the progress in Georgia to empower communities where it has traditionally been very hard to vote. And there's just literally no question about it. I also want to talk really briefly about the last bullet here, because we haven't talked about this very much yet, but what is happening at the state level to take power away from local election boards, and this is also the case in Texas and many other states, is really, really scary. And I say that because local election administrators, y'all, they're saints. They want to do a really good job. I don't care who they vote for. They want to have a safe, secure, low cost, well-administered election. And I say low cost, like they want to be in budget. You know, these are people who work for good elections. And these recommendations that I talked about earlier, they come from those communities where they see what works. And when you're having these election boards that are doing the work and cannot be swayed by a political party, and we literally have that on tape at the state level from this past year. But when they are not caving to partisan pressure and they're making decisions like in Texas, where they decided to run 24-hour polling sites because that met the needs of their community, they're taking those powers away from them. And it's very scary, and it's something that we should all be paying very close attention to. Next slide. Arizona. Okay, this is one of the craziest things. So I mentioned earlier, again, about how we have all of these things that are best practices that have worked really well. The permanent early voting list in Arizona is one of those things. It has, up until this year, almost been exclusively been used by old people in Arizona who are retired, and it's hard for them to get out. They're on it. It's easy. When you register to vote, you fill out a button, like a bubble. It's so simple, right? And when we went into 2020 nationwide, we knew it was literally more likely that you would get struck by lightning than have voter fraud by vote by mail. Okay, so that's how often it is over the course of a 20-year period. That's the cases of fraud. So, you know, when the legislature goes after permanent early voting list, it's really going after something that has been embraced by its base. And it's something that has been embraced by the local election officials. You can speak to people in Arizona where they have run, and this is actually a great place to talk about bipartisan conversations, because we've been able over the past year to have a lot of bipartisan conversations with local election officials about how effective this is. But it's really, it just doesn't make sense. And it's part of this whole fraud. Vote by mail is fraudulent. We are exposed by this. Now, I'll say on the flip side that this is not a foolproof system. People who have Hispanic names are much more likely to have their ballots discounted within the system. And so it isn't foolproof. And there are reasons for reform without question, but attacking it as an unsafe mechanism to vote is just not founded in truth. And I want to talk about Arizona a little bit more in the sense that this summer, the Supreme Court came down and upheld an old lawsuit in Arizona that basically said, and we talked a little bit about this, that if the law has the effect of disenfranchising voters based on race, it no longer is protected by the Supreme Court. So this particular law affected people gathering ballots and taking them to drop them off, or it affected people coming in and going to polling sites that were not necessarily their precinct. That affects Native American voters the most because of the distance to polling sites. These laws specifically disenfranchise people in those communities in a state where there's a tremendous Native American population. And one of the really cool things about the Freedom to Vote Act is that it actually sets out provisions to protect Native American voters, which we do not have in any other existing legislation. It also sets out, and this isn't actually on any of these slides, but I'm going to throw it out there. The laws over the past year have more impact to disenfranchise voters with disabilities than anything we've ever seen. I don't know how it's not even happening. And the Freedom to Vote Act actually is the first law to provide, well, the American with Disabilities Act should, but it's the first law to provide true support of disabled voters as a class and make sure that they are not attacked by state legislation, which they are being right now. Next slide. So I'm going to intro this slide and then pass it over to Jessica to round it out. So we talked about legal barriers to people voting, but I want to talk about some social barriers too, because a lot of times, especially when all of these legal barriers are in the news, it scares people even more. So the Knight Foundation told us last year, and I think everybody has used this, the most common reason people don't vote is because no one asked them to. Now that's something that everyone here can do. Empower a friend, let them know that their voice matters. The second thing that keeps people often from voting is because none of us want to feel dumb. You don't want to feel dumb and ask for help in the process. So I encourage you to use both of our resources. We have state-by-state pages. This is pretty common on headcount.org. We walk you through the whole process in whichever way that you want to vote. And then we actually link to and support the League of Women Voters system because it's one of the best and oldest out there. And Jessica, if you want to pitch your.
Yeah, so Vote 411, and you can visit Vote 411 by going to vote411.org. It's the League's one-stop shop for all of your voting needs and all of your voting information. So you can go in to the website, you can plug in your address, and you can get a specifically designed candidate guide for you. It's definitely includes federal and candidates, and most state and local leagues participate as well. And so you can get information on your candidates on down to the municipal level. Find out what they believe in, find out answers straight from the candidates about their positions on different issues. And then while you're there, you can find out what you need to use to vote. You can find out if you need to take an ID with you. You can find out if you where your polling location is closer to the election. You can find out anything that you might need. If you need an absentee ballot, how do you get an absentee ballot? The information is all right there. And you can also register to vote on this site as well. So this is your one-stop shop for anything related to registering to vote, to finding out what's on your ballot, and to finding out what you need to bring with you or how to vote in your own local jurisdiction.
As I said, we're big fans of the League's tool. We do a very similar thing, not with the candidate guides, but I think it really depends on who you're sharing it with and what is where they're going to feel the safest. Ours is written very much with young voters in mind. It's written in language that we hope will engage 18-year-olds. The League's is probably a little bit more fleshed out for a larger population base.
It's completely nonpartisan.
Ours is too. Yeah. So we're going to talk more about calls to action later on in the presentation or in the program here, but I know we both are working to change elections. Right now, Headcount has a campaign that's very focused on the state level called Save the Vote. It is a really cool portal. You can actually go to headcount.org/save the vote. Even if you don't want to take the call to action, it'll tell you what's going on in your state. And it shows you where your state ranks on ease of voting. That was going into the 2020 election. We don't have the new rankings with the new laws. So I encourage you, if you're really interested about what's happening in your community and are interested in taking based actions, to visit our site.
And if you're interested in taking action at the federal level, we have a great action page with a number of different calls to action. This one in particular is directed towards the administration and asking President Biden to put the full weight of his office behind moving voting rights legislation forward. But there's other actions on our site at lwv.org/take action on the Equal Rights Act, Equal Rights Amendment, DC statehood, all kinds of different things. I think we are finished with our presentation.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Jessica and Tappan. We have questions coming, and please, everyone, keep them coming. We will save them. We'll direct them to our panelists soon after we hear from Dr. Sally Yancey Boudrum, who I'm excited to welcome. So let me make sure you all can see my screen.
Hello?
Can you see my screen?
Yes, I see you.
Okay. I want to make sure, are you seeing? I want to make sure you're seeing the right thing. For some reason, I'm not seeing the little green.
I can't see them. Yes. Hello?
Okay.
Yes.
Hey.
I'm Sally Boudrum.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sally. Can folks see? I'm sorry, I just want to make sure maybe one of the other AAJ members can speak up as well. Can you see the slide deck?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm honored to introduce Dr. Sally Yancey Boudrum. Dr. Boudrum is a retired elections poll judge in Maryland, and she actually comes from a family of poll judges. She is also a Christian minister and teacher and is deeply involved in interfaith dialogue. She's actually a longtime friend of our community, so we're excited to have you on. She offers insights based on her lived experience and legacy to ensure our understanding of voting rights. Welcome, Dr. Yancey Boudreaux, I'll hand the floor over to you.
Yes, thank you. I'm pleased to be here to listen to all of the points about voter rights. And it has been threatened ever since the beginning. It's nothing new, it's just more added blocks. But the same way that we overcame years ago, we will still overcome. It's always been a fight, you know, but we win. We win as long as we don't give up the right that people have died and bled and dogs have bitten them and all different kind of calamities. We will win. And I just love the presentation that was given today by the previous speakers. And what we must do is double down, you know, get busy and just be determined to see this thing through. And we will. But when we get through with that, there will be another challenge. Life is full of challenges. But every time we go through one thing, it pushes us to another. And it helps us to gain from what we have been through so that we can do a better job as we go higher. So I'm encouraged. I'm encouraged and always have been because I've been through a lot of Jim Crow situations. Praise God, and it's no longer Jim Crow, he's James Crow now. So he's constantly showing himself, you know, that he is determined to keep people back. But it's an act of fear, that's what it is. When you see people acting ugly and setting forth laws and changing laws, it's all due to fear. But there's nothing to fear but fear itself. So therefore, we are to keep persevering. And we learn from what we've been through. And we will overcome. Not someday, but every day we overcome something. So I thank you all for allowing me to have a word to say on this behalf.
Thank you, Dr. Yancey Boudreaux. I liked that turn of phrase. It's not Jim Crow, it's James Crow, because in fact, you know, and maybe this is my interpretation of what you're saying, but at least from what I'm seeing, there's sort of what I would call less overt, maybe more sophisticated in the worst of ways in which, you know, the vote is being suppressed. But in any case, thank you for your work and thank you for your remarks. I think now is a good time to actually take some cute questions that we have from our attendees. And I saw that we had a couple of hands up. So first, let me just read out some of the questions that we have in the chat, and then we can move to the hands that are raised. So one of the questions we have is the League of Women Voters going to propose changes in the Electoral College? And I guess the same goes for headcount. You know, are either of your organizations going to propose changes to the Electoral College?
So I'll start. So the league does have a long-standing position, and our policy and lobbying and advocacy guidance all follows through our booklet called Impact on Issues, which are positions that have been developed by our membership. We do have a long-standing position that supports the abolition of the Electoral College. We are looking at it and considering our next steps, considering the political environment. But one of the ways that we have engaged in kind of an offshoot of checking on the Electoral College is through the thing called National Popular Vote. which is a move to change how electors are chosen and how they vote for the people who win the popular vote in their state. So that is being worked on at the state level all across the country by leagues and by other organizations. So that's one way that we're helping to change the Electoral College. But as far as direct action to abolish the Electoral College, stay tuned.
Mhm. Great.
We do not. I'm a quick answer. We literally just have positions on legislation that directly impacts making it harder or easier for people to vote at head count. And it's more about education and information on our end.
Got it. Okay, so the next question we have is someone would like to hear our panelists talk a little bit more about their position on requiring registered voter IDs to vote, which seems to be a growing trend.
I'll go first. This is always a fun one. And I say that, and I'm going to preface this whole conversation by letting you know that I just moved to the state of Virginia. It took me 3 months to get an appointment with the DMV. And I got in and I was rejected, despite the fact that I am a very well-educated and person who understands how these things work. I didn't have 2 printouts of proof of address. I just had one along with my marriage certificate, my passport, my social security card, and a few other items. And I was rejected, and everyone in front of me was rejected at the DMV line that day. And I just want to throw it out there that it is not easy to get an ID for everyone. That being said, the vast majority of the American public across party lines supports the idea of having identification. Again, headcount doesn't take a direct position on this, but we have made it a priority within our organization to educate people about what a proof of residence is, what a voter ID is. We have long lists of all the qualifying IDs in various states. And we believe that identification should not be a barrier to someone voting. And so we feel it's our job to make sure that there's never a moment that people in our community aren't prepared well before Election Day to be covered with those needs. Again, we don't take a direct position on it, but I would say with our Save the Vote campaign, it's been really interesting because we've had this in the field and we try to talk to people. Voter ID is not the center of this campaign, although it is one of the things listed that states are changing, but we don't take a position on it, right? And people get so angry. People yell in our faces about voter ID. It is a very divisive issue, and we have young volunteers all over the country out there talking to people, doing the work. And this is something that people are very inflammatory over. So I just put it out there that it's really interesting, and I'm sure Jessica can speak more directly about how the Freedom to Vote Act treats voter ID differently than the For the People Act did. But I think it's a very interesting moment in our history because there is no question that this impacts people of color differently than others.
Yeah, and the league has not supported, so we have traditionally a longstanding position of not supporting voter photo IDs. And we know that voter ID laws are actually incredibly discriminatory. Tappan said earlier in the presentation about how some states passed voter ID laws within 24 hours of the Shelby County decision. I think Texas is one of those states, right? And states have traditionally passed these laws to ensure that minority communities cannot vote and cannot participate in the process. We know that voter IDs put up a barrier to voting. So like if you are a woman and you have changed your name, you're going to another state, you might have to have proof of the change of your name. You might have to have not only your birth certificate, but then a proof that you changed your name. So a marriage license, and then, proof of residency and proof of your address. Like there's incredible steps that people have to take And for people largely in the African American community or Hispanic, Latinx community who don't have access to all of those documents, because you sometimes also have to purchase those documents. So it's also a financial barrier if you're not able to purchase those documents. And then you can't register to vote, and then you can't vote. So it puts up an incredible barrier to voting. And the League has traditionally opposed those strict voter ID requirements. Now, I will say that like Tappan said, the Freedom to Vote Act does put into effect some voter ID requirements. But it actually, what it does is it expands. So for states that already have existing voter ID requirements, it actually forces them to expand the options. So it can't just be your driver's license or a picture ID. It can be things like your bank statement within 6 months. It can be a copy of a utility bill within 6 months of the election. It can be a hunting license. It can be a student ID, which some states have actually traditionally purposely omitted so that students can't vote in their states. So it's incredibly expansive. It's actually based on the West Virginia model. And it forces those states who already have ID laws in place to expand the options and the requirements for voter ID. But so the League supports that bill and expand the expanded list of voter ID options.
Excellent. Anything else to add, Dr. Yancey Boudram?
I want to say that once again, I would like to just to keep encouraging people to vote, because sometimes when we hear about so many obstacles, some feel, well, what's the use? Why should I vote? Remember, the vote is supposed to be the voice of the people. So no matter how we are prone to get discouraged, we have to go on and keep fighting. We've come this far by faith and by working. At one time, there was no vote at all. We couldn't even go to the poll. And if we did, that we were either beaten or killed or something would happen to our homes. So we've come this far. We cannot give up. And we should be thankful for people who are so educated and so involved with the political systems who know what exactly is being done to the people to keep them from being heard. So we are so thankful for all that I have heard today. It's just so vital. And all I can say is keep on keeping on. And I join in. I'm constantly at my church telling people, to vote and to listen to different things that's going on. Because if we don't listen, if we don't learn, we will be taken advantage of. And that's for anybody. So we have to listen and we have to be informed. Otherwise, we will be duped to thinking that it's no use. But there is a use. And that's why they're so afraid. They are afraid of the people. They are afraid of the vote. Remember, it's fear. If they can keep you down and keep you from going through and pressing your way, then they have won. But they can't win as long as we are determined that we are not going to give up. We're going to keep fighting and keep going on with Reverend Al Sharpton and to so many of the others who are on the front line, constantly fighting for our rights, our voice to be heard.
Yeah, well said, Dr. Boudram. I mean, I feel like so much of voting in this environment, it really is, it's an endurance race, it requires a lot of grit, and there's so much we can do to encourage each other to persist. So I see that we have one hand raised, maybe more. So let me go ahead and unmute the first hand that's raised, which is Athia Qureshi. I wonder if, Athea, can you hear us? Are you able to unmute? Okay, so we actually have another question here for our panelists. What are the panelists' opinion on the Supreme Court and how they might enable the reduction of voter rights?
I don't see tapping unmuting, so I'll take a first shot at that one. I mean, I think it's, so the two decisions that we talked about today, in particular the Shelby County v. Holder and the Brnovich versus DNC, I think they're incredibly disappointing, right? I think that the Supreme Court has a job and they feel like they are doing their job by interpreting the legislation that Congress puts forward. I personally, our organization disagrees with their decisions. But at the end, you know, so we just disagree with the current the decisions they've made about those in those cases, you know, but it's up to Congress to respond to those decisions. It's up to Congress to put in laws that that look at the way that the Supreme Court has analyzed it, you know, and go back and, you know, if you need to, we need to modernize the Voting Rights Act and update the formula to ensure that it's, you know, doing the things in our modern times. And that's Congress's job. And Congress, since the 2013 election, or since the 2013 decision in Shelby County, has not done that. So it's really time for Congress to step up and to respond to the decisions that the Supreme Court has put out, if they want to ensure that we are protecting the right to vote for everyone across the country. You know, the league does not have a position on expanding the court, so I don't really want to talk about that. But you know, there's a reason we have checks and balances in our government, and if the Congress doesn't agree with the decisions the Supreme Court is making, then it's up to them to make laws that respond to that. And we can do that by passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. We can do that by passing the Freedom to Vote Act. And I hope that you all contact your senators to make sure that they do that.
Yeah, I'll just follow up to say, you know, headcount doesn't, again, have a direct position on Supreme Court, the Supreme Court's role in developing election law, but we do rely on the courts for checks and balances. And it's concerning when the checks and balances no longer feel like they really support equity and protecting the freedom to vote. And I'm not a lawyer. I have read a fair amount of these decisions, and some of them are admittedly over, you know, they're things that I'm not going to know because I didn't go to law school and pass the bar. But I will say that we have a long history of not, I mean, I guess 1965 to now is not a long history really in the history of the world, but in our country since 1965, we have had bipartisan support to protect the right to vote, protect the Voting Rights Act, and to make sure that discrimination is not changing the voice of Americans and letting people pick their voters to affect elections. In 2013, that changed. And the fact that in that decision, Justice Roberts wrote, Congress, fix this. And it has been stonewalled since that time because of the dysfunction and fear of losing power that we see many people hold. And I just I can't tell you enough how important it is for your federal and state elected officials to know that you are paying attention to these choices and that you value the freedom to vote for all Americans. Because if they don't hear from you, they're going to protect their power by making bad choices often. But if they hear from you, they know their power is threatened because you're their voter. And that's where your voice becomes so impactful.
Yep. It's funny. I was just having a conversation this morning about voter suppression with my mom, and her question was, well, why aren't the courts doing anything? And really, this is an opportunity to, in any case, I was explaining to her that really it's the court, if you disagree with the way the court interpreted the law, the court interprets the law. That's their only job. And if you disagree with the way it's been interpreted, then it's Congress's job to change the law. And I think this is a great moment. I think in different parts of our history, the courts sort of interpreted the law in a way that allowed for expansion in the voter rolls, but not with the Supreme Court. And so in this situation, we should maybe put our hope or put pressure on Congress to do their job. But okay, so we have another question, and it is since Mr. Trump's election to the presidency, what became the biggest challenge in your opinion for equal voter rights?
That's like a hot potato. Nobody wants to hold it. I'm not going to say since, and I'm not going to attribute this to Mr. Trump directly, but I would say that the division in our country, which you could date back to 2011, you can date back to some moments in the 90s, you can date back to when they started using the filibuster to stop the Civil Rights Act. There's moments in our history that have created more and more division, and there are moments where we come together. But really, the division in our country, the other, whatever the other is for you, and maybe hopefully it's not for any of the ladies on this call, but the sense of the other has really made our work hard. I believe in democracy. I believe in a country that is based on the exchange of ideas, where we value each other's opinions and we grow together because we know none of us are absolutely right. That's what our experiment is about. That's where Aristotle founded our democracy. And the sense of the other and the polarization in our country, it has changed our work. It's changed how we talk to each other. And it has really changed the relationship between Americans and their votes. And I hope that we will see some return to trust and value, because I think that is essential to our nation and our creed, really.
I agree with Chapin. I think the polarization of our country is really driving a wedge in how we talk to each other, how we communicate with each other, how we just love each other sometimes. But the other thing I'll say is, and I don't know if this is just since the election of former President Trump, but it's maybe something we've started to see a little bit more. I think another thing we have to combat is mis and disinformation. How people's opinions sometimes become facts, or the way that news and the way that we share things on social media. I think if people really just get back down to, what is the law and what's not the law with regards to voting, or, doing the research that they need to do to find out who stands for what. You can vote for one to do that. But fighting that mis and disinformation about what voting is and who is voting, that's had a huge impact on our work. I think it also is rooted out of that polarization and how we just don't trust each other anymore. So make sure you do some research and find out what the truth is before you just go believing random things on the internet.
Yep. So I see that we are close to the end of the program, so I don't want to I want to make sure we make time for unfortunately we don't have time for further questions, but I encourage our attendees to please reach out if that's okay. I'm volunteering you, Jessica Tappan and Dr. Yancey Boudrum, but please reach out to our panelists. Please reach out to our organizations if you have further questions that we can help answer. Jessica and Tappan, you mentioned that you directed us to your websites to take action. Can you sort of elaborate more on the importance of taking action? And is there anything we can do now?
So so I think the reason I got into politics is because and involved in lobbying and advocacy is because I firmly and strongly believe that government is for the people and should be driven by the people. So if you want change in Congress or you want the president to support voting rights and move things forward, you have to tell them, you have to contact them. So one of the actions you can take if you go to our website, and I'll actually just plug the direct link here into the chat for those who are interested. Our action right now is encouraging President Biden to put all of his strength and power behind making sure that we get these voting reforms passed in Congress so that they can come to his desk and they can be signed. So if you go to our website and this link, you can plug in your address. So it's just your street name and number, and then your zip code. Submit it, and it'll pull up your a letter that you can edit and send to President Biden himself, and encourage him and the vice president to take action.
My link was in the presentation, and I will drop it in as well. But I would like to put my support to people reaching Biden right now, in the league being the primary action. And I'll tell you the reason why is this new bill that's in the Senate, which could really support us, may require that the president support changing Senate rules so that it can be voted on differently. And he has been very hesitant to do that. I'm not going to tell you whether or not you should support that or he should do it, because I'm not allowed to. We don't have an official position, but that is the reason to reach out to President Biden right now, is to let him know that that's important. And I think it is a moment where today, that is a good reason to reach out.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Thank you all. Thank you to all of our panelists. We are going to be wrapping up our program shortly. I do need to make a correction here. I'm told that I sort of misstated the sort of the intro of the Alliance for Absolute Justice Women, our sort of mission. We do not support political parties. I want to make that clear, but we do support groups that uphold voting rights. So thank you again to our panelists. I will now ask and welcome Aisha Sial, a member of the AAJ Executive Committee, to provide some closing remarks.
Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Have we made a transition? Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam. I can hear
okay,
you.
You can hear me. All right. So when we get the video, that'll be good too. But for right now, I want to say how when we have a meeting or a gathering, we do have a closure of a silent dua. But before we do that silent dua, there's a short video clip that our technology guru is putting it together for us so that we can watch comments from our international spiritual lead. He was asked a question recently about the state of the world, and I think his answer really speaks to like our core belief in terms of, we have one God and we should be good to each other. Let's let's watch this video before we close.
My question is, what is your opinion on the current state of the world? You see, if people did not recognize their Creator and their Lord, their Allah Ta'ala, and did not discharge their duties towards Him, and what Allah Ta'ala has told us to do, if they did not do it, then the world is fast going to doom itself. So this is why we are here. We have to let the people understand that if you did not practice what Allah Ta'ala has said, if you did not change yourself, then this is going to be your fate. And only those will be saved from this sad end of their life who will remember Allah Ta'ala. Even, everywhere you say there are atrocities, there are cruelties, brutalities happening, whether it is being done by the big powers to the poor nations, or whether it is within the nations, within the Muslim Ummah, or even small countries. So everywhere there is chaos. We have to let them understand what are their duties. And this is the duty of an Ahmadi, to let the people understand, and it's a great responsibility on our shoulder. This is why I have been telling all the time to the people of the world, to the politicians, to the leaders, that they should change themselves and try to establish true justice, absolute justice in the world, and discharge their duties towards their Creator and their fellow being. Otherwise, there is no guarantee what is going to happen. And what we can see is very dark and bleak end of this world. Okay?
Okay, Jazakallah. My question is,
So thank you very much for being present, and it's sobering to hear his words, but he says it in such a loving way that I felt, let's share this message, and we'll have a moment of silence. I will begin with let us pray, and then there'll be silence, and I'll say Amin, and that will be our closing for this meeting. And thank you so much for venturing into this educational space. All right, let us pray. Amin. Again, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone.